So welcome to Caribbean Thoughts Lecture 5. Today we want to look at we want to discuss the issue of identity or heritage. Particularly the question, have we misunderstood our heritage? And we also want to quickly go back to tracing Caribbean history and roots. A discussion about an understanding of heritage must include a trace of Caribbean history and our roots, especially with new research, which challenges the book Arawaks to Africans, which suggests that the people of the Caribbean today who came to replace the indigenous population have no connection or bearing, biological bearing, to those people, to the indigenous population. That is being questioned today, not only the Caribbean, but also here in the US. The ability to question what was thought to be something stems from critical thinking that we delved into a little bit last week. It was very important. The ability, to question. It comes from the practice of philosophy. Okay, philosophy is the pursuit of truth, and you have various branches of philosophy, but critical thinking is important, especially as and I said sometime later on you're going to hear me say, and I think I said it last week, the post-colonial thinker must be a critical thinker. The post-colonial thinker must be a critical thinker, especially when you understand the strategy that has gone into recreating this new world in the mold of a people that is foreign to it. Okay, so it is it's very important then that we begin to trace our Caribbean history and roots when we begin to think about Caribbean, because the post-colonial thinker is a critical thinker. I've been kind of preparing you guys for the question anyways, asking, have we misunderstood our heritage? Okay, so and that's a very, very important question. But before we get into that, we'll show you those questions. Critical thinking, we looked at critical thinking last week. We defined critical thinking as thinking about thinking and evaluating current and past thoughts, highlighting the importance of reflection. We did say that. When you talk, critical thinking is about reflection, and so at this level, there's a lot of critical thinking that takes place. That is what separates the college student from students who are not, or people who are not exposed to this level of education, because we promote and we promote critical thinking, which is reflective thinking. And reflection involves revisiting certain positions or presuppositions. So that's, and John Dewey defines it as that. John, who is said to be the father of reflective or critical thinking, but however he's not, because he quotes people like Bacon. Okay, there are other people who have been doing reflective thinking, or what I call iconoclastic thinking, image breakers, or breaking the image. That comes from thinking deeply about things, or philosophical thinking. So we talk about so the next thing, we also emphasize the importance of critical thinking emphasizes the deconstruction of reality and the pursuit of progress. So we emphasize the deconstruction of reality and the pursuit of progress, because when you think critically, you're thinking, the thinking is directed towards a particular goal. And we emphasize the deconstruction of reality, the deconstruction of philosophy and discourse. So in this class, we're deconstructing history, we're deconstructing philosophy. We mentioned, we discussed that briefly last week. We talked about Descartes and the existential dilemma. Descartes and talk about existentialism, existence, and talking about the self. but Descartes and the existential dilemma of his coming to terms with his own reality. And his own dilemma points to the need for, points to the importance of doing critical thinking as a post-colonial thinker. So we discussed Descartes and his famous quote, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am, because he's trying to make sense of his own reality. And so he decides to stop. He decides to think that he starts from ground zero. Nothing exists. Nothing is true. Let's begin with that. But to begin with that is to acknowledge that something is thinking to do that. So the only thing that he cannot deny that there is a mind that thinks. Okay. So, and when you start to think about objectivity and subjectivity, to be objective does not necessarily mean to be free of subjectivity or subjectivism. It also means to recognize that we are beset by subjectivism. And so therefore we have to be very loose and explorative in our objectivity as we approach life about anything. We explain Descartes' exploration of existence and the role of the mind in affirming reality. And note that Descartes' proof of existence is limited to one's own reality. Yet there are those who have sought to create generalization or universalize certain truths or certain ideas and make it even normative, as if this is the ideal. But then we talked about the issue that this human nature, this tendency that people have to privilege, okay, to privilege certain positions. But again, remember, so we looked at Descartes' proof of existence being limited to one's own mind, to one's own reality. And so therefore, if it is difficult to come to terms, to come to a conclusion without one's own mind or free from one's own thinking, the subjective, then we have to now question man's penchant, man's drive of universalizing their reality. Of course, somebody talk about the problem of culture and the problem of, we talk about the issue of the Caribbean as a whole, but the Caribbean as part of a whole. And in fact, even within the Caribbean, the islands, and even within the islands, you have the individual. So there is also the challenge of wanting to be part of the whole, but at the same time wanting to be separate and wanting to be a human being with one's own drives and personalities and so on. We talk about critical thinkers throughout history, mentioned in critical thinkers like Michel Foucault, who is said to be a structuralist, postmodernist, although he would say that he's not necessarily a postmodernist. But he talks about how institutions are created in societies to continue a particular knowledge. Immanuel Kant talks about, Immanuel Kant says that history is a result of the varieties of human natures and circumstances. And of course, we talked about Karl Marx challenging Adam Smith's idea or theory or justification for the wealth of nations in capitalist societies or in wealthy societies, Karl Marx. So we briefly mentioned those thinkers as very important too when we discussing critical thinking. We highlighted their challenges to existing knowledge and societal norms. We also talked about Emmanuel Gramsci, where he says all men are philosophers. It's not excluded to just some. But there are those who devote themselves to the study of philosophy, and there are those who do not. Okay, does that make those who devote themselves to philosophy better thinkers than others? Well, then the question is, what is the basis that one is using to come to determination? What is the basis? It is a basis that caters to your position that would lead to a win, So that's some of the questions you want to ask when you engage people and when you think. So we discussed the impact of critical thinking on inventions, innovations, and societal progress. We didn't do that part too much. Post-colonial, postmodern perspective. We explain how critical thinking emerges within the post-colonial and postmodern context. And if you guys were listening, and if you go back to watch, it was a 3-hour video. I actually watched it. It was deep. I left the class last week saying, what did I talk about? But then when I watched it, and several other persons, it was really deep. It covered a lot. And I hope you guys get a chance to really go back and watch the videos because they're deep. But critical thinking emerges within, it emerges within the post-colonial and postmodern context. We talk about the 1930s. And I'm going to reference the 1930s. The 1930s was pretty revolutionary in the Caribbean. I mean, there's labor unions were rising. It was a very depressed time in society. We talk about the New Deal in the US that started the development of social welfare. And we won't get into social welfare, but in the book that I'm writing, I make a comparison between social welfare in Jamaica and social welfare in the post-industrial country, the US. We won't get into it in this class. We won't have time for that. But I would love it to be great for you guys to get an opportunity to read that. And I wrote a paper on that, looking at social welfare, and really in the 1930s. Social welfare is way before the 1930s, but in the way we think about it in a very scientific way, it really started between the 1930s and 40s. The rise of labor unions, the thinking, this movement towards independence. But by the time we get to the 1940s, in the Caribbean, people were thinking about a federation. In the 1930s, they were thinking about independence. But by the 1940s, they were thinking about the federation in the 1930s, 40s. But in early 1940s, we pushed late toward the 1940s into the 50s. Then they started talking about going it alone, independent instead of talking about independent Caribbean, they were talking about independence. I don't know how that came to be, but I thought that is what has helped to dog Caribbean. They needed a kind of unity to mitigate against what was coming. But little did they know what was coming, because we were too insulated or insular or focused on a kind of nationalist, populist independence without thinking about planning for the future. Okay. So but we talked about the issue. Critical thinking emerges within the post-colonial and postmodern context. And we discussed the question of dominant narratives and challenging institutionalism. Briefly, Homi Bhabha talks about the periphery and the center, but we didn't do much of this, so we'll talk about that later on. We haven't mentioned, we briefly talked about Frantz Fanon, Homi Bhabha, and V.S. Naipaul as examples, but there is one class that we will get into when we talk about. We're going to be talking about Frantz Fanon, Homi Bhabha, V.S. Naipaul. There's one class that is tailored just to talk about the Negro is not any more than the white man, and wherever and the colonial subject is a political creature in the global sense of the term. That's Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask, and Wretched of the Earth, respectively. And of course, Homi Bhabha, and I think Richard Philcox, who helped to translate and create and provided commentary on Frantz Fanon, and in such a unique and in an amazing way in the book Wretched of the Earth. But then Homi Bhabha goes on to talk about Frantz Fanon and V.S. Naipaul and other Caribbean literature and the post-colonial in a unique way. And in his book, The Location of Culture, a very important work. And of course, V.S. Naipaul is a very important Caribbean literarian or writer that we will discuss in one class. We will spend the time to look at them. But last week we looked at analyzing. We said that critical thinking involves analyzing and evaluating ideas and thoughts. And we said that critical thinking, we describe critical thinking as a metaphysical and analytical process. And we talk about metaphysics is to is what metaphysics, of course, is a branch of philosophy that asks what is ultimately real about reality. In other words, okay, so you are going deeper and deeper. You're cutting. You're looking at the component parts of things. It involves, we explain it in terms of dissecting and exploring thoughts, patterns, and actions. I don't think we highlight the use of logic, common sense, reason, and expansive thought. We won't get into that, the issue of, but part of critical thinking is logic, because critical thinking involves philosophical exploration. And when we talk about the issue of logic, you have inductive reason and you have deductive reasoning. We talk Caribbean thought, thinking involves reasoning. There is no reason. You thinking that there is no reason without thinking, and there is no thinking without reason. Okay, so logic is very important to the concept of Caribbean thought or critical thinking. Sorry. We also looked at the issue of being fair, open, and in one sense we are biased, but in another sense we are not. Well, people, if you we said that the post-colonialist is a skeptic. He's suspicious of knowledge. He's suspicious of historical truths, because it is that history that has come to create the Caribbean position. So of course we have to be fair, we have to be open. But I said the post-colonial thinker is a skeptic. But the thing is, the post-colonial thinker has to acknowledge personal biases. We talked about critical thinking involved the importance of having trained ears, eyes that see beyond the obvious, seeing beyond the obvious. And we also mentioned the need to examine and evaluate different perspectives without taking sides. But in a sense, that's going to be hard to do. How can you do that without taking sides? Because human nature are bent in those ways, taking sides. So how do we do that? Say, for example, Caribbean thought, we're taking Caribbean side, in a sense. So how do you mitigate against that? Of course, again, it begins with acknowledging one's skepticism. And we're going to play a tape in a few minutes. So when we talk about the subaltern, because we mentioned critical thinking within Caribbean thought and the idea of the subaltern. We're going to play a 12-minute video. It's a lecture as well, but from somebody else. But I thought it was very important that they talked about C.L.R. James and the Black Jacobins. And of course, there's another one that I want to present to you today. Hopefully we have time. Okay. Developing critical thinking. Critical thinking is developed over time through training and exploration. And we talked about last week in terms of critical thinking, I talked about how it started, the academy or the educational school, it becoming a discipline so that they can train. I said to people, part of the problem we have in society today is because many people lack the skill to think critically. And I say, for example, there is this big debate in the US about gun laws. And gun laws, whether or not everybody should have the right to bear arms and so on and so forth. And I said to people, look at the Caribbean, look at Jamaica. Jamaica and many countries in the Caribbean have the most restrictive gun laws, gun policy. Nobody have the right to bear arms in Jamaica. No one. Okay? It's very difficult. It's not a right to bear arms, okay, in Jamaica or the Caribbean. If you study the Caribbean and look at their laws towards bearing arms, it is restrictive. Unlike the US, everybody have the right to bear arms, and so they want to make it more restrictive, especially the kind of high-powered weapons that people have. But I said to people, okay, fine, look at Jamaica. Jamaica has a restrictive policy in terms of the right to bear arms and so on, and access to guns. Yet, Jamaica has one of the highest crime rates in the world. Trinidad, their crime gun, well, it's not as high, but it has become a problem for Trinidad today. Barbados, not so much. Definitely Guyana and Haiti. Okay. So these, when you look at the Caribbean and the gun policies that we have in the Caribbean, it is very restrictive, yet crime and violence is high. So I said to people, it does, okay, in fact, what has happened in the Caribbean, and particularly Jamaica and Haiti and part of Trinidad and Guyana, is that they have an underground, or what is known as a black market. So usually when governments or societies try to limit access to something, what happens is that there's always this reaction. There's always an underground economy, or a black market, as they call it, black market, okay, that operates outside of the systems. So what people do is that they become very creative. Okay, and in fact, that's why they have the argument about criminalizing black people, because of the kind of criminalizing black people, because black people do certain things, perform certain activities that they have criminalized. What am I getting at? I won't get into it yet. But we talk about guns. So the gun policy is restrictive. Nobody have the right to be a gun in the Caribbean, yet the Jamaica and the Caribbean have the highest crime rates. Of course, it could be an issue of what we call relative deprivation. Relative deprivation. This is not the time to talk about relative deprivation. It is something that we will talk about later in the class if we have time. But of course, it is something that you have to talk about in Caribbean thought, the issue of relative deprivation, especially in Jamaica and in various parts of the Caribbean, and especially in black and brown countries, or countries where you have a higher concentration of black and brown people. Crime and violence is high. But there is also, what's also high? Poverty and income inequality compared to other parts of the world, where you have more white people. And I'm not being racist, it's just the truth. That's from study. And that's not from anecdotal evidence. Okay, studies. It's actual study that has been conducted. When you actually look, and if you yourself were to do a study of all black countries, black and brown countries, and study their crime rate, study their corruption, and we're going to talk about corruption later in the class. Or if you want to jump ahead, there is a lecture on corruption that talks about the corruption index. And the NIA has a video, but it's dated. But but I have written something new about that, the corruption index of the Caribbean. I think there are one or two Caribbean countries where the corruption index is not that bad, but the majority of the Caribbean islands. But when you go to Haiti and Guyana, it's even worse. Okay, but the issue I'm raising here, as it relates to, I'm emphasizing an idea from Caribbean thinking, based in critical thinking. And the point I'm making is, when you look at the Caribbean, if you were to look at the idea of relative deprivation, which is a Marxist materialist theory, that says societies that have high income inequality, or where there's income inequality and poverty, will also have high levels of crime and violence. Okay, that is not a new theory. It's not a new theory. Okay, it's something that has been around. I mean, it is a theory that has been around for a very long time. Of course, we said it's a Marxist materialist theory. And so part of the discussion that we need to have when you look at how do you mitigate crime and violence in countries like Jamaica and the Caribbean, or in communities, black communities in the post-industrial communities, or in Caribbean diaspora communities in the post-industrial society, they also have high crime and violence. How do you mitigate against that? Okay, because if we are to think about restricting gun violence, restricting people's ability to bear arms, that hasn't helped really. It creates more problems. Okay, so that is why it's very important to do a study and to think expansively about things and clearly about things. So there is another study that talks about income inequality. Fine, what's income inequality and poverty in Jamaica? Of course, my first book, which is the textbook for this class, Neoliberalism, looks at income inequality and poverty. And one of the things we talk about is that income inequality and poverty mirrors GDP growth in Jamaica. Okay, it's never been steady. It was high in the 50s. GDP was above 4%. Was about what? I think it was 5 point something percent. We have never had that in the Caribbean. Well, not. I mean, particularly Jamaica haven't had that, despite the fact that we've had resources. But the point I'm making is that so income inequality and poverty, income inequality has risen in Jamaica. It was an income we won't talk about income inequality right now, but income inequality looks at consumption and household consumption. That's how it is measured. And I talk at length about income inequality and how you measure income inequality. You have perfect equality and you have income inequality. And I think Jamaica's figure was very high, but if you look at global income inequality, it's rising, but it's not as high in certain countries, depending on the racial or demographical makeup of those countries. But in the Caribbean, compared to other parts of the world, income inequality is high. Okay, not only income inequality, but it's rising at an alarming rate. But not just that, but there's also the issue of poverty and abject poverty, which at one time it was at, I think a couple of years ago, when I interviewed Shirley Ann Fraser, who is the executive director for the Hearthwood Foundation. Her study suggests poverty at 21%. Mine wasn't that as high, it was 75% thereabouts. But especially with during COVID and beyond that, poverty was on the rise in Jamaica and the Caribbean. However, we were hearing that crime and violence was, the government was doing as much as they possibly can to address crime and violence. But the addressing of the crime and violence is they're making it into a police issue, a security issue, when crime and violence sometimes is not necessarily a police issue, okay, or a security issue. It's an economic issue. Deal with the economics, or it could be an issue of ethics, okay, and socialization and so on and so forth. But we live in a society that's very myopic. And so when we think about fixing issues, it begins to first thinking critically about things, okay, and then seeking to apply the fix. But we talked about, so we're looking at the post-colonial man as a critical thinker. The need for post-colonial individuals to engage in critical thinking highlights skepticism towards history and its creation of the present, okay. Of course, we mentioned Karl Marx again. And the post-colonial thinker being a skeptic is important because of how the Caribbean came to be and who we are as people in the Caribbean. Okay. What the strategy that has gone into recreating the new world and making the Caribbean as a place and the people within it second class or third world, or we call it, there were usually Caribbean people or Caribbean places were referred to as third world or developing, but it was always this, and I think it was Alice that talks about the issue of using the word tribe to describe Africans. But the terms are important, and when you start to study terms, then you get to understand why we have to be critical thinkers. So, for example, okay, there are in terms of discoveries that's accredited to people of African descent were never given to him or her, was accorded to the European, because the Negro was said to be less than, okay, or what what Homi Bhabha said of refer to V.S. Naipaul in one of the books that he wrote, that nothing great ever come from the Caribbean or the black man. So therefore, then you have to reconsider. You have to say, for example, we talk about the misclassification of the African. Now they are saying that many Africans have ties to the ancient people. It is said that Christopher Columbus discovered Jamaica and the Caribbean, the Americas. But did he? There were other peoples here before. The post-colonial must be a thinker, but because there was always this drive to redefine him, to bring him down to size, so to speak. So therefore, it's very important for the post-colonial to be a critical thinker. So critical thinking is transformative, and it is revolutionary, and it is very important to the practice of Caribbean thought. Okay, so that's for last week. This is part 2. I won't do the Negro is not. Why is this important? I have here on the slide, to start anew anything requires a journey in a past. To start anew anything, anything requires a journey in a past that begins to tell our story. That's very important, especially I write in the epilogue of this new book, Reimagining Peoples Within Critical Race Theory, moving from a victim approach to a hero approach. Dana Berry is one of those persons who is writing to reimagine the African or the Caribbean, looking at his resistance, looking at the Black man in terms of the value and his resistance, that speaking to his intelligence. But we won't get to this. But what I will talk, what I would want, what is important is the fact that Fanon says that the Negro is not any more than the white man. And I begin this particular exploration by saying, to start anew, to start anything new, anything requires a journey in a past that begins to tell our own story. Our own story. And so, and it's important because, and why this is important, fine, since I'm here. Frank Fanon again says the Negro is not any more than the white man. The Negro is not any more than the white man in black skin, white masks. And in a sense, he's doing psychoanalysis of the colonized, the systematically controlled man or woman. He's doing psychoanalysis in the sense that he's removing the dominant view. He is creating an empowered self, much like Sigmund Freud. But he combs colonialism with the empowered self. He removes the dominant view of comparisons, striving for the empowered self. Because let me tell you, when I read this book and when I saw this statement, the Negro is not, by the way, so this is wrong. It should be the Negro is not, full stop, any more than the white man. That's how he wrote it. You don't write, when you compare things, you don't compare things like that. You normally compare things with something else. That cup is bigger than the other. But he does not do that. He would say that cup, full stop, is, well, maybe he would say that cup is, or that cup is big, bigger, full stop. The other cup. That's how he would approach it. That's his psychoanalysis. He does not, he refrains, he doesn't believe in comparing things based on the dominant view. Because when you start to compare one thing in relation to another, then it places a certain value on one thing in relation to the next. So he removes the dominant view within comparison, striving for empowered self. And according to Omi Baba here, the familiar alignment of colonial controlled subjects is disturbed by a break. So in a sense, this is his resistance. This is his violence. A pause from the usual way to reveal a truly authentic self. And that's what Baba said of Frantz Fanon as it relates to this particular statement: the Negro is not a full stop any more than the white man. And I am saying that this was his violence. This was his resistance. And somebody wrote that I advocate for violence some time ago. And I said, I do not advocate for violence. Okay. What I advocate, Yes, I do advocate for violence, but not physical violence. Yes, not physical violence, but a kind of violence that breaks from the norm. So it could be when Homi Baba talks about the center and the periphery and her affinity for things that are off center. That's her violence. When Frantz Fanon write in a way that does not subscribe to the English language, breaking up one sentence into two, that's his violence. Not okay. When Louise Bennett, okay, in use the patois, the Jamaican vernacular, the patois in her formal writings and her formal speeches and so on. That was her violence, because usually you don't speak patois formally. Okay, you're supposed to speak that in certain registers. Talk about the issue of registers, but she went beyond that, and she spoke it in formal functions, and she spoke it at informal functions. That was her violence. That was her resistance. I write that when we hear of Jamaica and the Caribbean, we think of beautiful islands of paradise with sun and sea and sand and reggae music and cannabis and Arab people like Usain Bolt, who are living out their best dreams, desires, and lives. But neoliberalism analyzes the motif, and motif is the foregoing idea, given the historical and current economic and political situation in Jamaica and the Caribbean and the global South, in an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, and injustice. The people of the global South find themselves in North metropolises with very little agency and minimal change to their lives. In fact, except for the use of cleaning neoliberal waste. Oh, listen to this. Let me say that again. This is deep. In an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, and injustice, the people of the Caribbean, or of the global South, of which the Caribbean is a part, find themselves in North metropolises. In other words, those people who have left the global South to the global North, or they are outward looking or upward looking. But, and I say to you, Frantz Fanon write that the global man in Wretched of the Earth, that the colonial man is a political creature. A political creature. He's a creature, meaning he is created. The colonial man is a created being of the Caribbean. The colonial man is created. That's what Frantz Fanon said in his book Wretched of the Earth. Writes that the colonized man is a political creature in every sense of the earth, meaning that he is still a wretched of the earth whose experience of ambivalence tends to a negative experience of contrast. Negative experience of contrast. Again, Fanon had written in Wretched of the Earth that the colonized man is a political creature in every sense of the term. But today, the post-colonial man is still wretched of the earth, whose experience of ambivalence tends to a negative experience of contrast. What am I talking about? Listen to this statement, what I said here, which is in the book. This is very deep. I said, when we hear of Jamaica and the Caribbean, we think of beautiful islands of paradise with sun, sea, sand, reggae music, cannabis, and Irish people like Usain Bolt, people who are living out their best dreams, desires, and lives. The much time I've heard, what are you doing here? Jamaica is amazing. What are you doing here? Of course, Jamaica is amazing. But the book, so I said, read the book. It will tell you how I'm here. But the book analyzes this motif. This motif, M-O-I-M-O-T-I-F, this prevailing idea. The book, this prevailing idea, given the historical, historical, and current economic and political situation in Jamaica and the Caribbean and the global South. Because the Caribbean, the global South, we are all connected. Our experiences are connected. We are all coming out of a post-colonial experience, and we still experience the negative. We are still experiencing the negative part of that post-colonialism. Follow me. This is important. When we think of Jamaica, we think of island paradises, or okay, people are living out their best dreams, Bob Marley and so on and so forth. But then I said, the book questions that motif, because in an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, and injustice. I mean, there is no injustice in the Caribbean. There's no poverty. Of course, there's poverty in the Caribbean compared to everywhere else. Of course, there's income inequality. Okay, we talk about the 6 richest families in the Caribbean, the families that are the wealthiest and so on. Anyway, we won't get into that right now. But the people of the global South find themselves in. So okay, if it was such a bed of rose in the Caribbean, why is it that we have one of the challenges of the Caribbean is brain drain? Or why is it that why is it that immigration policy towards people of the Caribbean is so restrictive? Because they're just like the people in Mexico and they are going to places, and immigration is a big issue today. Anytime there's an election in the US, immigration becomes a very important issue. Immigration becomes a very important issue. But immigration cannot be, you cannot discuss the issue of immigration outside of a history of lack, a strategic history that has created a Caribbean or a black and brown position that has made them always traveling, always ambivalent. And I said to people, when people got independence, it was an independence that benefited the people who wanted to give it. Okay? Because slavery and so on and colonialism was, after a while, colonialism became outdated. People found other ways to control and to make money without having slaves. In fact, you made these people into people who can spend, give them a little bit, give them some pittance, then they pay you. But anyways, in an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, and justice, the people of the global South find themselves in North metropolises with okay, fine. It's island paradise, but they're going in droves to the north, or they want to get there. They do whatever they can to get there if they have to. But when they get there, what do they find? When they get here, what do they find? The immigrant. This is what they find. In an attempt to escape. In an attempt to escape the adverse realities? How are they escaping the adverse realities in paradise? That's why I'm telling you, the book challenges the motif. In an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, and and injustice, the people of the global South, of the Caribbean, find themselves in North metropolises with very little agency. And of course, I'm being probably a little bit general here, as if all Jamaicans and all people of the Caribbean are breaking themselves to leave. But I said to you, they're not necessarily breaking themselves to leave. But when I talk about, it's not necessarily the outward, the externality of the Caribbean. Okay? The externality and our openness, the fact that we are so open to penetration. And I said to you, when you start to study power and control, you have to study the issue of penetration. And one of the things, and when you start to study, Alisa asked me, oh my God, Renaldo, that is loaded. Life is about people and how we relate. But life is what you make it, or allow others to make of it for you. And then we start talk about the issue of power, and life is about people and how people really talk about human dynamics. Part of studying the Caribbean, what is the Caribbean place in the world? the Caribbean people in the world. In other words, you're looking at the dynamics of humanity, the dynamics that exist in society today. Okay, the dynamic that exists today stems from something in the past, which continues through strategies today. And the issue of penetration is important because how open you are will determine the ability that people have to penetrate, to impose, and to flood your country with goods and services without anything that you can do. Okay. In an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, injustice, the people of the global south find themselves in North metropolises with very little agency and minimal change to their life, because people travel. Why people travel? People travel looking for opportunities. People travel, okay, looking for change. Yes. And I have said in the last class, or in a particular class, one of these classes we had, talking about what existed in the Americas. In the Americas, the Taino people were people who traveled all along the coast of the Americas. The people before the 1400s or 1492, before Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbean. Okay, the Americas. There was travel. Travel was a part of the Americas. And they would travel whenever the seasons or the climate change, or if there was, or if they had utilized all the resources, and okay, then they'll have to go somewhere else. And the thing is, nobody cornered off anything. There was no fencing, so you could just go from place to place within your group. The only fence that exists was within your group. But when the Europeans came and took colonialism to the next level, then that all changed. In an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, and injustice, the people of the global south find themselves where? In the north, in the global north, in the post-industrial, in the developed. Notice we don't use the word third world. Okay, that's backward. It suggests that we are third, and we are not. Language is important, and we are all about what? Reimagining peoples within critical race theory, not thinking race, but moving away from a victim approach to a hero approach. So therefore, we won't use derogatory terms that define us as second. So let me continue, but this is very important. So they travel and they find what? Very little agency and minimal change to their lives. In fact, now this is powerful. In fact, this is from the book Neoliberalism. In fact, except for the use of cleaning neoliberal waste, the immigrant is usually portrayed as what? As an alien with 3 heads and big sharp teeth, seeking to steal and destroy the profit and disrupt society. Why? I mean, I wrote this. You know, something was happening in the US when I wrote this, and I used to work for a Child, Youth, and Family Services agency in Philadelphia. It takes a village. And part of my job, I was a family group decision-making facilitator and coordinator. It's a new model in dealing with the number of people who are in aggregate care. Aggregate care means group homes. Especially in Philadelphia, aggregate care surpasses that of the national average. I think they were aiming for 12.5% or something of the sort, and at that time, it was in Philadelphia, it was way beyond that. It was probably almost in the 20% or 21, 22%. We were trying to get it back down. So we started what is known as Family Group Decision-Making Conference, which is something that I really want. Because I'm so busy, I'm doing so many different things, I can't really spend time to really sit down with JTS and the dean and probably speak with Jamaica about incorporating this particular model in how we practice. And it's a model within Black and Brown communities. It really works in those communities, because within Black and Brown communities, we the kind of family we promote. Of course, the community is what raised the kid. It was always part of the issue. Okay, the extended family is important. The pastor is important. Okay, the uncle is important. The big brother, the sister, the cousin. the OG, whatever, and so forth. The community is what will raise it, especially with the problem of fatherhood. Okay, and even now it's not just fatherhood, but motherhood and fatherhood is a premium in Black and Brown communities. Okay, so now what we created a family group decision making program or model, and part of that model was to bring the family together, to empower them, to identify the problem, and to sit them down at the table and have them come up with the plan. They come up with a plan, and it covers a lot. It meets a lot of needs, because my job was to expose them to planning, okay, and also to connect them with resources in their communities and give them the tools to plan. And I was to facilitate the plan, but they are actually leading the plan. And they come up with the goals, the tasks, the timeline, and who is responsible. And then we sign off on the plan, and it goes to the judge, and we try to have a buy-in from everybody. That was really, and I think that is something I would want. I would going to definitely recommend you guys to consider in your own, if you're doing social work, even as a pastor, as something that you could do. But FGDM is very good, and I did that. But the point I'm making here is we find ourselves, when I wrote this, I was doing a conference. I was facilitating a conference for a family whose children who was part of the program, the CYS. We had taken the kids away, or the kids were on the verge of being taken away temporarily, placed them into DHS care, and then identify the problem, and then come up with a solution that speaks to the problem, involving the community and the family. Because the goal is not to keep the kids. The goal is always for the kids to be in a place, but a place that was safe. So one of the things we talk about in child, youth, and family is risk factors. What are the, okay, we want to ensure that there aren't any risk factors in the home or within the community. Okay, so we have to ensure that the risk factors, so we have to do what is known as a risk assessment, and so on and so forth. And so therefore the family comes together, and we do that, and that's very powerful and important. So anyways, I had a meeting with them, and we facilitated a meeting. One person said to me, "You're not even from here." No, the person said they come up with a plan, and the plan was for the child, for another young person in the family, for another family member who was but the family member was underage. That family member wanted to keep the children. And I said, no, that can't be a plan. I won't approve the plan. I mean, first of all, the Department of Human Services won't approve that plan. Okay, we can't put the kids in your care because you are underage, so on and so forth. So she started to attack me. How I'm not American. How I get this job. and you know, I was writing this book at that time. Okay. And of course, I wrote the book over 7 years, because it was also part of my thesis. And I said, the immigrant is seen very little agency, minimal change to in fact, except for they find themselves in North metropolises with very little agency and minimal change to their lives. In fact, except for the use of cleaning neoliberal waste. The immigrant is usually portrayed as an alien with 3 heads and big sharp teeth. It's either they are good, this is the argument in immigration here in the US sometimes, or in post-industrial country. For those people who are defending immigration, they are great to work, to prop up the country. Yes? They are great cleaners and domesticated workers. Yes? So I use the word, okay, they make good helpers and so on and so forth. And of course, many Jamaicans don't have a problem coming here to do that. But many people from the Black country, when they come to these countries, it is as if they are seen as being good for certain things, and they justify and champion the immigrant for certain things. Cleaning neoliberal waste. Outside of that, on the negative side, for those who are against people from the global south um, um, becoming normalized persons in this country. The argument is that they are aliens, big sharp teeth, they're criminal, drug dealers, so on and so forth. They are a burden on the U.S. economy. So I said, in fact, except for the use of cleaning neoliberal waste, the immigrant is usually portrayed as an alien with 3 heads and big sharp teeth, seeking to do what? What is the immigrant from the global south trying to do? To steal and to destroy the profit and to disrupt society. And so I say, as such, we will discuss Black, Brown, and Pan-African struggles for economic prosperity, justice, and freedom, and to consider their efforts, abilities, or inabilities to chart their own futures since decolonization and realize real, notice I use the word real political independence and economic prosperity. And I said, perhaps they are charting their own course by the few corrupt, and I said to you, we're going to be looking at corruption. Okay? Corruption is high in the Caribbean, especially in Black and brown countries, African countries. Corruption is high. Is it? Okay? As a response to the issues of what we're lifting up, inequality and poverty. I said, perhaps they are charting their own course by the few corrupt of the status quo, who are benefiting from international partnerships with the neoliberal regime of the Washington Consensus, advocates for the bureaucratic phenomenon. Because part of the bureaucratic phenomenon, when we talk about bureaucratic, what is bureaucratic? Talk about the bureaucracy. We talk about something large and heavy-handed. Rules and regulations, red tapes and systems, and so on and so forth. And yes, but sometimes bureaucracy is a strategy to conceal those who are trying to benefit or to gain benefit at the expense of others. But we talk about bureaucracy and we talk about the Pharisaicalism. Do as I say, but not as I do. Talk about the bureaucratic phenomenon. Do as I say, but not as I do. The bureaucratic phenomenon, where in the with the WTO and the IMF and the IMDb, and this move towards developing a global world in the 1970s and 80s and the 90s, and countries had to sign to international agreements. The agreement, I call it bureaucratic because, and full of Pharisaicalism, because the Caribbean had to sign over their soul. But the people in the global north, they weren't doing it. And that is why they were able to penetrate the Caribbean. Because of this bureaucratic phenomenon where the Caribbean, after they got independence, they signed, and in the 1960s, they were met with the oil crisis, the OPEC oil crisis, and they need money. And they went to the international, the post-industrial countries who had created lending agencies, and they know what they were doing. They created these lending agencies way ahead of the oil crisis. Anyways, they created these lending agencies as if they knew that what was coming, but the Caribbean people didn't know. But anyways, created these lending agencies and these double organizations, and said, we are living in a global village. You can't subsidize, you can't have tariff. You have to liberalize your exchange rate, so on and so forth. But they weren't doing that. So they created rules, but that they didn't follow, but we were following it. And then I talk about the issue of our theology, the theology that we inherited. Yes, the religion that, whether or not theology inherited ideas of the world, and our religion kept us down because they were doing something that we weren't doing. They were doing something that they weren't doing something that we were doing. And so one of the things I talk about, say for example, casino gambling, and how the church in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and some other parts of the Caribbean, they were opposed to casino gambling, because of an inherited theology, okay? And whether or not that helped to keep us back in terms of the gains that we can gain from certain economic arrangements. But those are some of the discussions you will then proceed to have when you start to think in these ways, the policy decisions that we have in the Caribbean. Okay, it's very important. So that's for last week's class that I just did. Now we're going to get into tracing and defining Caribbean. But before I do that, the question for the day is, have we misunderstood our heritage? Have we misunderstood our heritage? We're going to get into that question. And so it begins by us in 1492, when we have to do a trace of the Caribbean. And by the way, where do we begin? Where do we begin the study of the Caribbean? We begin in 1492, when Christopher Columbus was said to have discovered Jamaica, and the Caribbean and the Americas. But why did he come to the Caribbean? When you read Arawaks to Africans and other European books dealing with the issue, Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbean, and he came to bring religion, in a sense. It was an evangelistic mission. It was an evangelistic mission. It was.
Sir,
yes.
Sorry about interrupting, but wasn't like other primary school texts state that that he ended up in the Caribbean by mistake and he was searching for gold for East Asia somewhere there?
Yes. Yes. Of course, they said that he came here by mistake. It was an error. But it doesn't matter. He was traveling wherever he's going, and I'm gonna talk about that in a second. So stick a pin on that, because if you're looking at the PowerPoint, you see ulterior motive. You have motive and you have ulterior motive. Yes, you have motive, you have ulterior motive. He was looking for gold, yes, and for profit, but also to satisfy greed, and because of the international competition. By that time, they were racing all over the world, the European countries, trying to find out which monarch is the wealthiest, because they're all related in Europe. They're all related. They're princes, cousins, whatever the case is. But they are competing against each other. And they want to be the wealthiest. But they also said, if you read the books, they also said that Christopher Columbus was also going to Christianize the New World. Because yes, his first visit, looking for gold, he was doing a conquest, looking for gold and so on and so forth, but also trying to find trading routes and so on and so forth. But the first time they went, they said they went looking for gold and so on and so forth, and spices and all of that. But then they went back after that, saying that they're going to Christianize the New World. They were going to do what? They were going to bring knowledge. They were going to bring religion. Yes? Techniques and so on and so forth. And that these people were devils and demons and brothers of Satan. And so he came here in the 1492 in 1492, and then he came back in 1490. Between 1492, 1493, 94. Now. So they came back, he kept coming back to the Caribbean, and then found a post and settled in the Caribbean. But please remember these people, the Europeans, religion was the order of the day. Okay? Not science, religion. Everything rotated around religion. And so therefore, as they embarked on this newfound exploration, Christopher Columbus is also saying that I'm going to Christianize these new peoples and new places. We're gonna carry religion, as if these people don't have culture, they don't have religion, they don't have tongue, they don't have their own ways. So he is going to. So it has always been about imposing one values on the other. They're going to this country to impose themselves, because what they have is not better than what we have. But also, they are going not only for that, but also to protect their interests. The ulterior motive was gold, profit, and to satisfy their greed and strategic positioning. Strategic positioning. Okay. In fact, when Christopher Columbus came to Jamaica in the New World and settled briefly, the part of the question that we must ask ourselves is, how did he treat these people? Did he have African slaves? There was there was no exploration to Africa. Okay, so the people who he enslaved were the locals in the Caribbean, the Amerindians, the Taino people. Okay, that's the people who they had dominated at first and intermingled with. But by the time, the Spanish kept Jamaica and many of their outposts as a strategic positioning to America, but they didn't think of Jamaica and parts of the Caribbean as important because there was no gold. Okay, so while some Europeans settled there and so on and so forth, but while some of the Europeans settled there and Christopher Columbus left a group of people there, not many Spain didn't think highly of Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados. They weren't profitable islands, so to speak, because then they realized there's no gold, but they just kept it temporarily. And but as we move towards the 1500s, and even more towards 1655, there was this, people started learning the importance of sugar and cotton and developing plantations and so on and so forth. And so in Europe, they realized that, fine, these countries don't have gold, but they have something that's just as good as gold. Great land that can give us, where we can do a kind of production to supply the world with sugar. And we can and if whoever takes control of that will become the wealthiest. And so the race started. But first of all, of course, a discussion, where do we get the people to work the land? And of course, they based on research and pioneers that had gone before that actually went to Africa, and the reading that they realized, okay, well, let's take those people from Africa. We're not going to use our people. We're going to use some other people from Africa. But then they have to justify to their peoples why they have to go to Africa and enslave these people, bring them, uproot them to the New World. Why was that important? Or how do you justify enslaving human beings and treating them the way that you're hoping to treat them? So of course, and I said to you at the last class, the issue of race is a new concept that started in the 1500s, coinciding with this with the transatlantic. And so this brings us into, and this is a very important point I'm about to segue into, because I'm going to segue into the issue of heritage. The issue of heritage. But before I segue into that, the question is, and this is very important. In 1655, Britain defeated the Spanish and took over many of the islands of the Caribbean that was once owned by the Spanish. And here I'm talking about the English-speaking Caribbean now. Now we're transitioning from Spanish to the English-speaking Caribbean. But what was quite interesting and important, which is I have to get, and you guys have to consider this, is where did the slaves that was in the Caribbean, where did they go? Say, for example, Jamaica. What happened to the slaves that Spain had? Whatever happened to them? What happened to did they free them? Yes, they did. They freed them. They freed the slaves, but who were they black, or were they the indigenous people that were there originally? Because we are told that there was a genocide. Okay, but where did they get people to work the land? We will talk about that when we come back in our next class. I'm sorry, not the next class. In this class, we'll take a quick break and we're going to talk about, have we misunderstood our heritage? Okay, and it's very important that we have a discussion of whether or not let me stop sharing my screen, whether or not we have misunderstood our heritage, because I'm going to share another document. I'm going to share another. Where is it? Where is it? Okay, no. I'm going to find it. I want to share another document with you as we get ready. I'm going to take a break. It's now 4:34. We're going to take a 5 minutes break. And then we're going to come back and do this other class, this other lecture. But I'm switching between my windows. Give me 1 second. There we go. I need this. Let me copy this. Go back to this. Good. Is this the right one? Yes. Control V. Ah. Here we go. There, I'm getting. Rex Nettleford, there's something. Okay, here we go. But are you seeing my screen? Rex Nettleford talked about. Rex Nettleford have a paper that looks at national identity and attitude to race in Jamaica and by extension the Caribbean. But Rex Nettleford wrote an article that looks at national identity and attitudes to race in Jamaica. It's very important. Usually I wouldn't get into this until later on in the class. But since we're talking about have we misunderstood our heritage, that speaks to the issue of our roots. And since people such as the Urban Indian Heritage Society is now challenging and questioning whether or not Black and brown people, whether or not their roots, and in fact there is a petition that's going around, and they actually they've been doing several studies throughout the Caribbean that looks at the Caribbean and their roots and their history. We will have them come and do a presentation. Hopefully we can get them next week. I'm hoping to have them next week. That means you have to be on time. In fact, I'm going to have class at 3:30, just in case you guys come late. So I'm going to tell them 3:30, so that at 3:30 everybody should be in class and ready to go. And it's going to be 2 persons presenting next week. But it's very important because we've always talked about Pan-African or being the Caribbean or Jamaica, Barbados. Barbados is a little bit different. Barbados is a mixture. Trinidad is a mix. It's Indian and African. In Jamaica, it's predominantly African. But now we are learning or hearing that no, what we have been told is wrong. Because when you study the logic and study the history and look what pertains, there is no way, okay, that all the Africans that all the peoples in the Caribbean have no relations with the original. What has happened is that there have been an attempt to corrupt Caribbean identity, Black and brown people's identity or root in our heritage, so that those people who have engaged in what we talk about theft, colonialism, theft, can continue to maintain and protect their ill-gotten gain. Okay, heritage and roots is very important. Heritage and roots very important. Recently, we thought Israel became a nation again in 1940, between 1947 and 1948. After World War II, The most powerful countries met in 1944. The most powerful country. You know who wasn't you know who wasn't there in 1944? None of the Caribbean countries, none of the developing countries, none of the colonial countries who are now independent. They weren't there. That's why they had the Bandung Conference in 1955, where all the nationalists and these countries that were colonial countries came together to discuss their independence. But in 1944, the post-industrial most powerful countries met to create a new world order. Part of that world order was to re-establish Israel as a nation again, so as to, for strategic positioning. In 1944, the most powerful countries met, the G8, France, the US, Germany, so on. They met Britain to reorder the world and to discuss starting the IMDb Bank, the WTO Bank, and these world institutions, the United Nations, so on and so forth. The Security Council came up with certain rules. Some people weren't there enough, but only the big countries were there, who made the decisions for everyone. So all their interests, so when they met to discuss, of course, they advocated for their own interest, because I said to you, we live in a global world, in a competitive world. So in 1944, they met after World War II to reorder the world in a particular shape, in their mold, in their eyes. Okay, so that the consequence of this, by 1947, 1948, Israel became a nation again. First of all, in 1947, they invaded Palestine, or the Middle East. Now, in the Middle East, who was living there? There were some Jews there, but in Palestine, it wasn't a nation state. There were peoples, Palestinian peoples. Palestinian peoples live in Palestine. Not necessarily people who were Jewish or Hebrew, but they were brothers and sisters, and they got along. But by 1947, by 1944, the powerful nations met and decided that they are going to have strategic position in the world. Part of that strategic positioning in the world was also in Palestine, in the Middle East. By 1947, 1948, they invaded Palestine, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, killing hundreds of thousands of people. In other words, they became an occupying force. Just as though in Europe, they went to parts of Africa, South Africa, yes, and became occupying force and made a nation for themselves called South Africa. And the African people who were there displaced them, created apartheid, and jailed Nelson Mandela, calling him a rebel and a terrorist, okay? Are you guys there?
Yes, sir.
Good. Calling him a rebel and a terrorist. Which today they're calling people Hamas, who was the elected leadership of Palestine, of the Gaza. They're calling Israel for the Israeli government, and Netanyahu, he does not approve of Hamas, the elected government. He wanted some other group to be elected, those who are more pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, pro-Hebrew. And so therefore, there is this antagonism. We've always talked about, anyways, the point I'm getting at here, in 1947, Israel became a nation again. 1948, 1947, they invaded Palestine with guns and machines under the auspices of the 1944 agreement. Because in 1944, the plan was that was to maintain a position in the Middle East. And just so you know, in the Middle East, they have oil. The oil deposits was okay. But of course, they said a part of Gaza wasn't Arab land, but they wanted strategic positioning in the region so that they can maintain their control. So what happened? Or to prevent another World War II from happening. But this is what happened when people are reactive. I said to you, in terms of gun control, they want to restrict guns, and thinking about restricting gun policy, having a restricted gun policy in the US. And I said, look to Jamaica. Okay, it's going to create an underground economy or black market. When people create things, you have to look at the consequences to that. Okay, so in 1947 or 1948, Israel became a nation again. And since 1948, there has been this ongoing the kind of tension, because there has always been tension between Palestinians and Hebrews, but not at the scale that we're seeing after 1948. But what was the justification for Israel what was the justification that the Israelis provided, or Israel and their legal team and their friends in the United Nations and so on, who were there at the 1944 meeting? What justification did they provide that was able to recreate or give them the opportunity to reclaim this land? What was the justification? Because we talk about international rules and laws and so on. The justification is that it was their land to begin with in the first place. In other words, pointing to something historical. The justification is that they lived there before, they were Jews, and they lived there before, it was their land, and they're going back to reclaim their land. Okay. And we're talking about roots, the importance of having roots and identity. Israel justified, or the Jews justified their occupation or their return, okay, or their occupation in Palestine as a return. They were reclaiming their land, which was already theirs. Okay, pointing to something, to an identity that was historical. Roots, that's why it's important. But the black man does not have any. Okay, in one sense we have roots, but in another sense we don't. Okay, say for example, where am I going at? It's important for the Caribbean people to know, also think of, and the American people to think about their roots. But what has happened is that our roots, our identities have been corrupted. That's according to some people, such as people at the Urban Indian Heritage Society, who are now questioning Arawaks, the Africans, and those historians who said that Jamaicans and Caribbean people and Black and Brown and African Americans have no resemblance or no bearing or connection with the original people that existed in the land, in the Americas. But now we're hearing of misclassification. Israel was able to point to something to go back to Israel. Now we talk about reparation. We talk about reparation. We're talking about reclaim. People in America are now trying to some people here who are Indians or whatever, or have some connection with Indians, are trying to reclaim land and so on and so forth. So it is within those people. It is within the interest of the post-colonial masters. Okay. Not to grant any justification or justifiable evidence to people of the Caribbean and Black and Brown people, any kind of justification that can point them to the original people here, because then they can say, well, this is our land in the first place. We are related or directly related to the original people. So then they can seek to do what? To make a claim. To make a claim. Say, for example, Haiti right now is making a claim against France because they have to pay France all this billions of dollars in order for their freedom to be recognized. But France is saying that, oh, it's not your country in the first place. They never said this. I'm saying this part. They stole somebody else's land, yes, and then brought new people there. Some of them probably were there before and intermingled. I mean, it's their land. However, France's justification is that, well, the people who are there, they were brought there from somewhere else, and they took or stole the land from France. France said it's their land. The Haitians said no, it's not. It doesn't belong to them. Okay, they are fighting for their freedom until fought off the French, and took over Haiti. So the France required them to pay because France is saying, no, it's not yours, it's ours. But France also moved on to that land and took it from somebody else. But then of course the Haitians could point to the fact that, well, we were there before, or we existed on the island before, or some Caribbean people, or people in the Americas now who are now saying that they're Cherokee Indian and so on and so forth. And so in America, they give some of these people land and certain privileges. So now that moves me into the lecture about the importance of understanding one's roots, the importance of roots, the importance of identity, the importance of heritage. Okay, remember how Israel was able to claim or to justify the occupation of somewhere because they point to some roots, some identity, some race. But when the Caribbean people came here from wherever they say we came from, let's say from Africa, or let us say some of us were from part of the original people here. Okay, but whatever the case is, there was an attempt to dilute and to corrupt and to prevent and to disconnect any line, any cord that connects the African man or the local to the original. If you saw how they group the Africans or the slaves, mix and mingle. They couldn't read. They weren't supposed to read. They weren't supposed to write. There was an attempt to dilute the intelligence of the African so that he could not reclaim his heritage or his freedom or do any kind of research that would create any discovery about himself that would then threaten the theft of the colonials. Rex Nettleford on national identity and attitudes to race in Jamaica said the need for roots and the attendant quest for identity are said to be natural to peoples everywhere. Natural to people everywhere. Natural. The need for roots. So when I ask the question, have we misunderstood our heritage? Or the issue of people's heritage being misclassified and the need to reclassify, because now there is a petition. There is a petition asking the government of the US and not only that, but the Urban Indian Heritage Society is also going to Jamaica and all of the Caribbean, and they're taking their education all over the world, talking about this misclassification and the need to reclassify us. The need for roots and the attendant quest for identity are said to be natural to peoples everywhere. Now, the phenomenon may be said to inhere in a people's desire to collate and codify their past collective experience, as well as to lay foundations for the realization of future aspirations. So, okay, let me say that again. He's quite profound here. It's important for us to collate and to codify our past and collective experience, as well as to lay foundations for why? Because it's important it's important for the realization of future aspirations. Which the Caribbean is an invention of the 21st century. Who are we going to be for the next future? New nations usually give large portions of their creative energy to what may be termed the identity problem. New nations, of which the Caribbean, we're all new nations in a sense, give large portions of their creative energy to what may be termed the identity problem. And there is the issue of identity is a problem to the Caribbean people. There is the issue of nothing black, no good. That has been ingrained in black and brown peoples. Okay. And that is, say, for example, we talk about changing attitudes towards Afro-Caribbean beliefs, and I'm asking you guys to write a proposal and to consider this as part of your final research and final paper, talking about changing attitudes towards Afro-Caribbean beliefs, changing attitudes towards identity, changing attitude towards the attitude comes, but where did the attitudes come from? It comes from something that has been ingrained in us. And so it is important for us to know to question critically the issue of identity. Say, for example, the coloration in the Caribbean is not just a Jamaican problem, it's a Haitian problem, it's a Guyanese problem. Okay, the issue of browning and the drive to using cosmetics to make you look brown. It comes from this worldwide historical understanding, okay, from stemming from colonialism to promote, and I talk about again, the Negro is not any more than the white man. So new nations usually give large portions of their creative energy to what may be termed as the identity problem. The identity problem for their creative energy to what may be, and to what may be, and the mid 20th century. Sorry, I apologize. I'm somewhere else. New nations give large portions of their creative energy to what may be termed the identity problem, and the mid 20th century with its flux of emergent countries in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean is particularly rooted or particularly noted for this aspect of nation building. Now, in Jamaica, a Caribbean country which attained independence from Great Britain in 1962, the search for identity has been the focus of attention for some time. It is indeed difficult to determine what exactly is meant by the term the Jamaican identity. It is, or by extension, the Caribbean identity. It is variously expressed as things Jamaican or the Jamaican image. Now, a reflection paper for this week, for next week, is to answer the question, okay? Is to answer the question or to determine your own heritage, to trace your heritage, trace your roots. It is indeed difficult to determine what exactly is meant by the term the Jamaican identity. It is variously expressed as things Jamaican or the Jamaican image. But what is the Jamaican image? I said to you when I came here for the first time, I didn't realize my video was when I came here for the first time to the US in 2006, first as an exchange student, as part of my study, as part of my ministerial formation with United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. I had to come to the US. I lived in Missouri. And people wanted to find out, why is it you don't embody the Jamaican image? What's the Jamaican image? My dreadlock, although in Jamaica at the time, dreadlock or the dreadlock or the Rastafarian was seen as a fringe member of society, wasn't part of the status quo, wasn't part of the accepted understanding of what passes for Jamaican, dignified Jamaican. You know, they were dirty. But yet still, when you come here, the expectation is that you're supposed to be Rasta. Such an ambivalence. What an ambivalence. Unless, okay, it's quite interesting. There are, however, ways of approaching the problem. The question, what are we, entails the desire of what we want to be. Oh, Rex Nettleford, amazing. God rest his soul. The question, what are we, entails the desire of what we want to be. What are we entails a desire, a desire. And I said to you in my epilogue of my new book, which is going to be the title of a third book I'm writing, reimagining people within critical race theory, not thinking race, but moving away from a victim approach to a hero approach. Because I do not believe in race. Race is a creation to justify slavery, or to create a society in the eyes of those who want to be at the top. The question, what are we, entails the desire of what we want to be, what it is that you want to be. And if what we want to be must have any practical significance for Jamaica, there should be some concordance. there should be some concordance. I'm having a headache between the external conception of the island. At the time it was 1.6 million. We have more than that now. We have 3 million people in Jamaica and 3 million people outside of Jamaica. And Jamaicans. Okay, so let me read that again. However, ways of approaching the problem. The question of what are we entails the desire of what we want to be. And if we want to be, and if what we want to be must have any practical significance for Jamaica, there should be some concordance between the external conception of the island people, on the other hand, and Jamaicans' own internal perception. Own internal perception of themselves as a national entity. As a national entity. And this is, now I just want to, by the way, I know I'm going to send you a copy of this. Let me just read briefly, because this is quite interesting information in the footnotes. I like using footnotes as well. Rex Nettleford also used footnotes. It's good. He says, after 307 years as a British colony, Jamaica gained her independence on the 6th of August, 1962. A strong Jamaican nationalism had shown itself from the 1930s. Again, let me say that again. A strong Jamaican nationalism, talking about what you are and what you want to be. In order to get what you want to be, they thought that nationalism was the best way, through a government of socialism. Anyway, a strong Jamaican nationalism had shown itself from the 1930s. That's the same time when Rastafarian was developing. Okay? When labor disturbances and middle class clamor for self-government characterized the political scene. But from the late 40s, there was a significant shift of emphasis to West Indianism. The late 40s, there was a slight shift of emphasis to West Indianism. So I stand corrected. In the 1930s, there was this nationalism. Yes? Then by the 1940s, there was a shift to West Indianism, which was perfect, which was amazing. Okay? Which was great. We needed a West Indianism in the plan for a federation of the British West Indies, which was actually established in 1958. 1958, we had a federation. Jamaica withdrew in 1961 by referendum from the federation. By referendum from the federation, and decided to go it alone. I talk about this a lot, how we decide to go it alone. Since then, the Jamaican image has become a positive goal for different efforts in the country. But I'm going to say this, that was our problem. That is what has affected Jamaican Caribbean prosperity. We decided to go it alone. Some person decided to create a referendum and give it to the people and say, hey, do you think we should have a federation? And the Jamaican people decided, but I think we did not provide the kind of education necessary for the people that the people needed to make the decision. Did they talk about ironies? Did they teach them what ironies was? What's an irony? Did they talk about what? Did we talk about globalization and competition and capitalism? Did we talk about that? Did we talk about the fact we are small and coming out, okay, and therefore it behoves us to in order to have a strong unity to come to discuss, to stay in this federation and slowly go it alone? But anyway, the question of our identity is a very important one. Okay, and when we come back from the break at 5, we will take an extended break. Instead of 5 minutes, I'll give you 10 minutes. So it's now 5:03. When we come back, we are going to begin looking at is Jamaica about our. We will begin the is Jamaica. Have we misunderstood our heritage? It won't be long. It will be only for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to give you. I'm going to have you guys do a quiz or a poll, which I started last week, but this I'm going to relaunch it this week. So for those that some of you left without participating in a poll, and I asked the question, what it is that distinguishes between Cuba and Haiti with Jamaica and Barbados and Trinidad. But I think some of you left. We're going to go back to that, but I want to go into have we misunderstood our heritage? Present the article to you guys, and then we go straight into the poll. And if we have time to do the to answer that question, we will. But we'll begin the lecture next week, delving into what differentiates Haiti, Cuba with the rest of the Caribbean. Okay, but for now, when we come back, we will look at have we misunderstood our heritage? Okay, we'll be back at 5:05. You come back at 5:15. All right, guys, welcome back. Excuse me, to the class. Just before we go into the lecture, I just wanted to let me minimize this. That can stay. Yeah, minimize this for a second. I don't know if I had sent this out to you guys. The information, a list of some currents and reflections in Caribbean currents. It's a rough draft of a list of Caribbean currents. I start with Arawaks to Africans from 1500s to 1800s. The period represents the historical transition in the Caribbean from the indigenous Arawak population to the arrival and enslavement of Africans during European colonization. The Arawak indigenous people were the original inhabitants of the Caribbean islands before the arrival of Europeans. With the establishment of European colonies, including the Spanish, English, French, and Dutch, African slaves were brought to the region to work on plantations, leading to significant demographic and cultural changes. Very important, okay? Leading to what? Significant demographic and cultural changes in the Caribbean. That's why we are said that we are an invention. This particular period is marked by influences from European colonial powers, African cultural heritage, and forced labor system. The philosophy behind Arawaks to African, the work that looks at the 1500s to the 1800s, it really combs European colonialism and Eurocentric ideals and research to talk about racial hierarchy, plantation, and plantation economies, and how plantation economies were set up, and how the plantation economies almost resemble the kind of economies that they were trying to create after slavery and independence. So we are challenging our Africans and what they have said about our heritage. And so I want to spend some time to reflect on the question, have we misunderstood our heritage? I want to share that with you. I want to talk about that quickly. To be honest, I want to also talk about the Black position in the world today, but I won't touch that because I don't think I have time. So I'm just going to go straight into, have we misunderstood our heritage? Very important question that we have to consider for this class. Let me close this. Navigate, let me close. Okay, so let me share my screen again. Wait. Oh, new share. Is it this one? I don't know. Has to be this. All right, great. Are you guys seeing my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what do you see?
You misunderstood our history.
Great, great. Question for you guys. Have we misunderstood our history? Do you think we have misunderstood our history? That's fine, you don't have to answer. But I begin by saying redefining a people so as to misclassify their identity and conceal their heritage is tantamount to genocide. Again, redefining a people so as to misclassify their identity and conceal their heritage is tantamount to genocide. If strategy is employed, so I'm answering the question, have we misunderstood our history? If strategy is employed, and well, if strategy is employed, and we talked a little bit about neoliberal globalization and strategies, the strategy that has gone into creating the new world, in disrupting Africa to create the new world. And later on, when we start to talk about Walter Rodney and look in and delve into his book a little bit, we look at how Europe underdeveloped Africa. The Caribbean experience is one of the ways that speaks to the underdevelopment of Africa, because the best and the brightest were brought to the new world. That has also helped to underdevelop Africa. But if strategy is employed that continues the dynamics today that had once characterized the transatlantic slave trade, then a re-examination of Jamaica's identity and heritage is warranted, specifically in relation to the Taino people who were the original inhabitants of our land. While acknowledging the presence of East Indians and Chinese. Now, just so you know, earlier I talked about, we looked at, I briefly showed you the timeline and highlighted Arawak to African from the 15 to the 1800s, and saying that the period represents the historical transition in the Caribbean from the indigenous Arawak population to the arrival and enslavement of Africans during the European colonization. And I said that the Arawak indigenous population were the original inhabitants of the Caribbean islands before the arrival of Europeans. But where are they now? Do we have any Arawaks or any Taino people or ancient Americans in the Caribbean? Because please remember, when we talk about the Americans, ancient Americans, we're using the word in a general way to talk not only about the mainland, but the Caribbean. Ancient Americans, that they not only existed on the mainland, but also in the islands. Where are they now? Where are the peoples? We have been, when you read further in Arawaks to African, they talk about a genocide. They were wiped out in the Caribbean with the establishment of European colonies, including the Spanish, English, French, Dutch, African slaves and African slaves were brought to replace the population that was wiped out. We were told that some of them committed suicide, especially in the case of Arawaks who were in Jamaica. They said that they were mild-mannered people, and many of them didn't fight back or resist, and they committed suicide, or they were overworked. But of course, I'm saying that's what we are taught. We are told, and the slaves came from Africa. But we are challenged. But we are saying that. But where are those peoples who were in the Arawakans? Where are they today? So I'm going to talk about that in relation to whether or not we have misunderstood our heritage, not in relation to Africa, but in relation to the Arawakans. So So if strategy is employed that continues the dynamics today that had once characterized the transatlantic trade, then a re-examination of Jamaica's identity and heritage is warranted, specifically in relation to the Taino people, who were the original inhabitants of the Caribbean. While acknowledging the presence of East Indians and Chinese who arrived during the era of indentured labor, again, while acknowledging the presence of East Indians, because the East Indian came, and the Chinese who arrived during the era of indentured labor or servitude after the abolition of slavery in 1865. The majority of the population comprising individuals with black or brown skin is believed to have African ancestry following the eradication of the Arawak Indians by the Spanish. The majority of the population in the Caribbean comprising individuals with black or brown skin is believed to have African ancestry following the eradication of the Arawak Indians by the Spanish. So the question is, okay, that is why I'm giving you the homework, the assignment, to go home and to do a research, or not really necessarily, it's not a big elaborate research, just tracing your history. Investigate, find out whether or not, how far back you can go when in tracing your history. How far can you go? So I said that this sets Jamaicans apart from other Spanish-occupied West Indian islands like Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Belize, and Suriname, which retained a small native Indian population despite the Spanish invasion. Now, Jamaica's history documents the replacement of the native population with African slaves. Again, Jamaica's history documents the replacement of the native population with African slaves brought there or brought to Jamaica by the Spanish. After the English defeated the Spanish in 1655, Jamaica became a significant port for the slave trade and sugar exportation. However, there is limited information available, and this is important, regarding the slaves and individuals whom the Spanish had freed following their defeat. I'm going to say this again. However, there is limited information available regarding the slaves and individuals from the Spanish, individuals whom the Spanish had freed, because when Britain had invaded Jamaica, the Spanish had a small group of slaves that were the locals. Many of them were American Indians. But there is limited information available regarding the slaves and Indians whom the Spanish had freed following their defeat. It is uncertain whether the small group of people who served the Spanish during their rule were of African or Indian origin, as the extensive trade or Africans to the islands or to the island did not occur before 1655. I'm going to say this again. This is important. It is uncertain whether the small group who served the Spanish during their rule were of African or Indian origin, as the extensive trade of Africans to the island did not occur before 1655. The point I'm making here is that, but we are not sure. Very little research is done. And the people who served the Spanish during their rule, were they African? Were they Indians? We are told that in the beginning they were Indian, and then later on they all died out. But we are not told, how did the African come to Jamaica when there was no transatlantic, or there wasn't any drive to bring Africans to the Caribbean as yet? So it would stand to reason that the people who served the Spanish were not Africans, but they were actually Indians. Because as the extensive trade of Africans to the island the extensive trade of Africans to the island did not occur before 1655. It never happened until 1655. Nonetheless, those who were freed by the Spanish sought refuge in the mountains. Those who were freed by the Spanish sought refuge in the mountains and established what's known as maroon communities. Maroon communities. The people who the Spanish freed just when Britain was invading. And those maroon communities persist to this day. And I asked the question, were these the original Indians? Were these the original Indians, or were they in any way related to the original Indians? Have we misunderstood our history? And I asked the question, before I continue, were these the original Indians? It's very important that you ask this question, because when the Spanish freed the slaves that they had, who went to the mountains and became maroons, then later on you're going to find that when the British eventually took over Jamaica, because the Spanish did not really protect Jamaica. They didn't see Jamaica at the time as any significant port. So they did not put, if Jamaica could have been a Spanish country to this day, but there was infightings between the locals there, and the Spanish or the crown did not see it fit to really invest in Jamaica. But anyway, the Spaniards who were there, they realized that they couldn't beat the British, and they freed their slaves. They went to the mountains, many of whom were Indians. Now, when the British came and they eventually started this, the slave trade started through the transatlantic, or the triangular trade started. Many of the slaves who were brought to the island, to Jamaica, we know that many of them also went to the mountains. Many of them also escaped, and some of them intermingled with the maroons, or the ancient or the indigenous population, many of whom were marooned in the mountains. So it stands. So there is an so it stands to reason then, that part of the understanding is that some of the Jamaicans that we have today, or some of the Caribbean people, may have had some biological mix with the indigenous population. Jamaica's identity extends beyond ethnicity, however, and that's important. Jamaica, and not just Jamaica, but the Caribbean. Our identity extends beyond ethnicity. We encompass a diverse range of people, united as one, because, say, for example, Jamaica's motto, out of many, one people. However, it is undeniable that the majority of our population has a predominant African heritage, and it's not just Jamaica, throughout the Caribbean, especially the English-speaking, the British Caribbean, the British West Indies. It is undeniable that the majority of the population has a predominant African heritage, stemming from the era of the slave trade. Now, the Urban Indian Heritage Society is currently challenging this narrative by presenting compelling research and data which suggests that Jamaicans have a rich history which is connected to the native Indians or to the island. Now, they argue that genealogical research reveals an urban American Indian root in Jamaica, an urban American Indian root in Jamaica, providing an alternative perspective to our historical understanding. Now, what I did was to, the following discussions between individuals on the matter is worth exploring, as it provides further insight into the historical strategy of corrupting a people or a place through misclassification of their cultures, history, and biology, so as to conceal or protect any gains that are ill-gotten. a strategy that involves diluting the purity of a people to prevent any claims that they may have to stolen lands, profits, or gains. That's very important. A strategy. A strategy that involves what? Diluting the purity of a people to prevent any claim that they may have of stolen land, profit, or gain. So this is a small group discussion we are having. Have we misunderstood our history? And I wanted to share that with you. Very important. And then you guys can go and have that discussion amongst yourselves. But I wrote in the article. To the Gleaner after I had interviewed members of the Urban Indian Heritage Society for a show who I was having, and they're doing groundbreaking research on urban Indian heritage and the misclassification of American families. Now, this includes Jamaicans, and they have been doing work on Jamaican genealogy. They will be coming to, oh, this should not be here. I will be, they're coming to the class to present, but this is what, listen to the discussion. What I did was to copy, put the discussions that we had in a conversation or in a dialogue, and it's very important that you follow me here. Now, the names are, the only person who has the correct name is me, Reverend Renaldo, but everybody else, they are pseudonyms. Okay, here, so CLI, so CL says, is it the Spanish who freed the Maroons or the English? Is it the Spanish who freed the Maroons or the English? Then how come their treaty is with the English? How come their treaty is with the English? That's interesting because it's actually the Spanish that freed the Maroons. But then, please remember that the Maroons, they were freed, but then the Spanish were also, the English was trying to also enslave them. Okay, and they couldn't. So that is why they had, there was a treaty with the English, but there was no treaty with the Spanish, but they were free. They went to the mountains. They freed them. I mean, no treaty is necessary. Why is a treaty necessary to free a people who are already free? People are inherently free. Yes? But Jamaica is one of the few countries in the region with little or no trace of the original inhabitants. I wonder if the African slaves also played a part. Just asking. Somebody, that was one commenter. I responded by saying, were the enslaved Africans and slaves indigenous? Were the enslaved African? Were they African slaves or were they indigenous? We are told that they were Africans, but is this true? And that the Spanish freed their captives and they fled to the mountains. One person responded by saying the majority of the original inhabitants were killed by the Europeans, majority, physically and by diseases. Others interbred with African slaves. Very important. You don't really read that part as when you read Caribbean history. The Maroons ran away into the interior of the land. The treaty was with the English because they were the last enslavers of Jamaican slaves. Read Las Casas' account of how the murderer Columbus disseminated the indigenous peoples and African slaves in Jamaica and Santo Domingo before the British, for which he was jailed twice. He was not afraid to write in his diaries that his fellow murderers fed the Taino babies to his dogs because the meat was tender. One gentleman said it should be noted that the actions of Columbus and subsequent conquistadors that followed in subsequent decades were not condoned by the Spanish government. In fact, Columbus would say to you that Columbus does not, there is nowhere where you, in Columbus's writing, where you find where he said that a plan was done to kill off the Arawaks. The Spanish monarchy, as well as the Pope, were appalled after hearing of the brutal treatment meted out to the native Indians and many times sent authorities to arrest them. Because of the long distances and lengthy time required to reach the Americas, the arrest warrants were practically useless, as the envoys of the Spanish crown were easily corrupted by the vast amount of gold and silver to be acquired in the colonies. News of the brutal treatment of native Indians caused outrage all over Europe, with many European monarchs deciding never to follow in the Spanish example and establish colonies in the Americas, example, the Hamburgs, as well as the various German princes. Many vowed never, but just so you know, that is why as they embarked on slaves from Africa, the justification was used to say the justification was used to defend the treatment of slaves, calling the Arawaks, calling the people from South Africa, from Africa, calling them savages because of the unpopularity of the treatment of the people in the Americas. Now, one of the gentlemen said, it has always been said that the Maroons have high cheekbones and thick, long, black hair. The Maroons. The Maroons have high cheekbones and thick, long black hair. This is because the Africans who fled to the hills to escape slavery encountered Tainos, Arawak, with whom they interbred. This accounted for the distinctive features of earlier Maroons. But I believe their genetic imprint has become increasingly watered down with the passage of time. I believe you are right. The Tainos, the Arawaks, were not all killed off by the Spaniards. A remnant of them escaped to the hills. And when the blacks escaped to the hills also, they eventually diluted and overwhelmed the Indian population through interbreeding. But interbreeding does not discount any connection, because if you were to do genealogical studies, it would suggest you can trace the blood type, you can trace the connection. So the connection is still there, even though it's been diluted by interbreeding. The UIHS will be presenting. Okay, sorry about that. Let's go to the next one. No need to wonder or speculate. A DNA ancestry test will reveal all. I took one a few years ago, and in fact, I asked some of my students in the last class to do an ancestry study, and one person went as far as to order a DNA ancestry test, and it was quite fun. And I'm gonna ask you guys to do that for next week, to come ready to talk about it. And we're gonna have the UIHS. They will be here next week. I took one a few years ago, and it revealed African, which involves Nigerian, Sierra Leone, North African, Asian, which involves Chinese and Vietnamese, and European, Scottish, Latvian, and Lithuanian ancestry, but not a trace of indigenous Taino DNA. Of course, I don't think they have any trace of the Taino people. And then, okay, they don't, and I'm going to respond to that question. According to their report summary, my DNA results are typical and representative of most Jamaicans. Most Jamaicans. And in fact, that is the philosophy behind the ancestry test. You go and order an ancestry test from ancestry.com. What is their philosophy? Okay, what is it that informed their philosophy? Did they draw blood or samples from, or have DNA put down? Do they have DNA from those people who are related to the Arawakan? No, they do not. That's too much work for them. A few weeks later, and we'll know exactly where on the globe the Maroons came from, down to the very village. I responded by saying, have you wondered why that is so? No trace of indigenous ancestry? Have you asked about their methods and methodology and philosophy? What is the method? What is their methodology in doing this ancestry or the genealogical test? Why they would not present any kind of nowhere, no Jamaican. I mean, you haven't heard, if you ask every Jamaican to do an ancestry, you won't hear any trace to any Taino people. In fact, they are limited by what they have and what they can tell you. They can only tell you what they know. They cannot tell you what they don't know, what they don't have. Which stems from a philosophy that says all those people were wiped out. So, of course, their method does not include those people because they're wiped out. So there's no way Jamaicans and Caribbean and Black people can be related to those people. And so you have to ask yourself those studies. That's critical thinking. Who are the people who conduct the research? Who are they? That's the next question. Further, did they match it against any indigenous people? And do they have DNA samples of indigenous people for them to conduct proper matching, or do they use generalizations? Now, one person responded by saying that DNA ancestry analysis is based on the work of scientists that have collected DNA samples of every human population spread across the globe. That's what they say. Okay. The work of collecting all this DNA and the statistical analysis took decades, but has resulted in, by decades, how long are we talking about? 10, 30 years or 200 years? It doesn't go back to 200 years, trust me. Okay. The work of collecting all this DNA and by the way, recently there was news that genealogical tests. There was a genealogy.com or ancestry. There was a study that was being questioned and in terms of their methodology and how scientific it is, and UIHS have created their own, our own. Okay, we talk about history from below, writing your own history. A journey in the past requires that you tell your own story. Okay, and you have to be very mindful of the strategy that has gone on historically to dilute and corrupt your own history, preventing any connection to the past that can disrupt and create any claim against those persons who have stolen wealth and now are living off the land. But according to this gentleman, these DNA databases are so accurate, and I'm going to say they're not so accurate. But according to him, they are so accurate that even police authorities the world over are using them to solve crimes. Using a DNA to solve crime have nothing to do with understanding your history as it relates to your DNA and your connection to the past, your connection to the Taino people. That has nothing to do with it. It's absolutely ridiculous and nonsensical. After doing my DNA ancestry analysis, the results reveal that I have second and third cousins all over the UK and the US, relatives I've never heard of before in my life. And all of this made possible by comparing the percentage of common DNA we share with each other. But what of the uncommon DNA? Beverly Brown Sands, PhD, said the Maroons who live off the coast of the Caribbean in the USA, were they originally from Jamaica? The Maroons who lived off the coast of the Carolinas in the USA, were they originally from Jamaica? And I said, that is interesting. What is documented and told to us is that after the Spanish freed their captives during the invasion of the British and the subsequent defeat, those whom they had freed went to the mountains and others went elsewhere, such as the southern coast of the US, which was part of the Carolinas. Now, critical race theory now asserts and is uncovering records of the connection between the slaves in the North and those from the Caribbean, and that they were active travel between the North, the Caribbean, and the Americas. But were the Jamaican Maroons actually urban Indians? Dalbert Hall says it was the Spanish and Portuguese who first started using Africans as slaves. The Spanish and the Portuguese. The English continued the tradition when they took over in 1655. So the Spanish and the Portuguese were using slaves, but as again, of course, we know that. where they were using African, started using the Portuguese. They were the first one to start using African. Spanish and Portuguese started using African slaves first. But as again, not to the degree that we have after 1655. Now, the Spanish, Italian, and the Portuguese started using slaves, started slavery in 1492. But where did they get these slaves from? From Africa? That is an assertion that we are making. Where did they get the African slaves from? Now, it was the Portuguese that started the transatlantic slavery first. It was the Portuguese that started the transatlantic slavery first. Portuguese were going to Russia for slaves, but the Russians learned the language, ran away, and blended in. Again, the Portuguese were going to Russia for slaves, but the Russians learned the language, ran away, and blended in. Now, the Africans could not blend in, even if the language was learned. Africans could not blend in, even if the language was learned. So yes, the Portuguese, the Italian, they started slaves, but they weren't getting slaves from Africa. We talk about they started using the slaves that they were using were probably the slaves came from Russia and other parts. They experimented with other slaves to a less degree, Africans, but the Africans and black people weren't considered less than in 1492. The black peoples, they weren't considered savages in a sense until we started the slave trade and the transatlantic in the 1600s. 15 going to the 1600s. That's very important to note. Now, Russians, according to Globetrotter, Russians running away and learning the language. The Caucasian region nowadays comprising part of Georgia, the Caucasus region nowadays comprising part of Georgia, Azerbaijan, etc., was historically a favorite location for sourcing slaves, especially by the Arabs and the Ottomans, present-day North Africa and Turkey. So many of them from North Africa and Turkey, who placed a high value on white Christian slave women. So the slave was at one point was white and Christian and slave and woman. Millions were carried away into slavery over a period of 400 to 500 years. Now, this puts the transatlantic trade into perspective. Okay, until the region was conquered and came under Russian rule in the 19th century, under whose sphere of influence they remain to this day. So although subjugated, being subjects of the Russian Empire had some privileges such as protection from Arab slave traders, and this is why slavery came to an abrupt end in the Caucasus, or in Russia as you call it, but more specifically southern Russia. Not because anyone ran away and blended in, but because they fell under the protection of the Russian Empire, who had the military will and means to defend its subjects from slave raiders. Okay, and so therefore, and so then you find the move now to try with a different kind of slave, but first to justify the type of slavery. Okay, so it's quite important and it's quite interesting, the conversation. I'm going to stop here because we're running out of time. We only have 4 minutes. I'm going to stop here, but this is quite interesting. Any questions so far, guys? As we wrap up, we're about to wrap up now because we only have 4 minutes left for the class. This is quite interesting, but if you don't have any questions, that's great. because I want to move. I want to spend the last 4 minutes. Sorry, the last 4 minutes. We only have 5 people in the class. I know Alice has said that she can't stay, but there's one of the student that came and left. Who is that? Somebody left the class. I'm not sure who it was. But anyway, let's wrap up with I'm gonna have you watch, but for the last 5 minutes, a brief video. Okay, a brief video, and we'll end there. Hold on a second. Let me bring it up real quickly. Any questions so far, guys?
Not at this point, sir.
All right, good. No, this is oh no, is this the one I wanted you guys to watch? Nah, this is it. This is it. This is for 13 minutes. And when this finish, we end class. Okay. But this video is for 13 minutes. I'm gonna share my screen with you so you have it. So let me go here, share screen. Is this it? Here we go. Pop. Share. Pop. Oops. Let me share sound. Share sound. Great. An Introduction to C.L.R. James and the Black Jacobins. Very good book.
R. James' book, The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture, and the Saint-Domingue Revolution. I'm Dealist with Glasgow, and I'm your lecturer for this series. C.L.R. James' book, The Black Jacobins, is a powerful and definitive history of one of the most important but under-recognized events in history, the slave revolution that took place in Haiti from 1791 until 1803. The book is important not only as a historical account of the event, but as one of the very first examples of history told from the point of view of the oppressed population, in this case the slaves of the island. James was a
It's told from the point of view of the oppressed population, the people living on the island. That is the subaltern view. That is history from below. Okay? Good.
Politically engaged journalist from Trinidad, and he spent considerable time in the book discussing the truly awful conditions of slavery in Saint-Domingue, as Haiti was then called. He looked at before the revolution and the remarkable leadership qualities of the slave-turned-revolutionary Toussaint Louverture. James' outlook in the book was very much influenced by Marxist philosophy, and this is what set the book apart from other accounts by other scholars of the Haitian Revolution. James wrote, "The revolt is the only successful slave revolt in history, and the odds it had to overcome."
That's very, I know it's 13 minutes. This is very important, guys. Very important. Okay. To Saint C.L.R. James's account of what happened in Haiti and the Haitian Revolution is different, okay, from all the other accounts that we've had, because the other account was told from a top-down approach. It wasn't from the subaltern. It wasn't told by the very people who the history affected, who were affected by the very history, and it was told in a certain way, in a different kind of a way. But now it's being told by C.L.R. James, who is in a kind of a Marxist bent, but quite very important. Very important.
Is evidence of the magnitude of the interest. James wrote, "The revolt is the only successful part from other accounts influenced by Marxist philosophy, and this is what set the book apart from other accounts by other scholars of the Haitian Revolution." James wrote, "The revolt is the only successful slave revolt in history, and the odds it had to overcome is evidence of the magnitude of the interests that were involved." Beyond the bottom-up history, that is, history told from the perspective of the marginalized rather than those of the elite status or politically influential members of society, readers of the Black Jacobins will gain a greater understanding of the political dynamics of the late 18th century. Now, this includes not only the events in Saint-Domingue, but the influence of the revolutions that took place in both America and France, and the key role that slavery played in these politics. When you're looking at a book like The Black Jacobin, you will be able to gain a fuller appreciation of the truly barbaric practice and the nature of the economies that were built from that practice of slavery. Now, the book is a radical work, and so it will appeal to readers who lean towards revolutionary politics, but it is also a work that is very engaging to a wider audience. So let's look at the work in the context of how it was written. The book, The Black Jacobins, is an example of what is called history from below. Now, although the term itself denotes works of history told from the perspective of people of low social and economic status, it was only used by historians long after The Black Jacobins was published in 1938. James' book was one of several works that inspired the field of subaltern or post-colonial studies. Here, historians from the branches of social inquiry, which deal with the various legacies of the colonial period, write history from the point of view of the subalterns being those groups that have been excluded from traditional power structures and opportunities, like slaves and peasants. James's approach to history, and indeed the whole of the subaltern school, cannot be understood without appreciating the works of Karl Marx, whose idea of history was shaped by the German philosopher Hegel's notion of the dialectic, a word that denotes the tension created between an idea or concept and the reactions that rise up in opposition to it. This antithesis eventually leads to a kind of synthesis, a fusion of the two ideas. Karl Marx built on this idea of the dialectic to develop his notion of historical materialism, where history is pushed forward by economic forces. The word materialism here should not be confused with its contemporary meaning, which is a focus on material possessions. Rather, Marx believed that the driving force of history was how the means of production, or the tools and resources used to produce goods and services, how those are owned and organized in any society. For example, in a capitalist society, most economic activity is in private hands, and businesses act in a way that promotes the profits and interests of their owners. As Marx wrote in the German Ideology, this mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. He went on to write,
We're almost wrapping up. We finished. We won't go beyond 6:15. What I'll do is we'll pick up with this video. In what time is it now? Because it's 6:05. We started a bit late, so and it's a very good video because I wanted to make a point about this. Very important point. You guys can interact with it in your interaction papers if you want, but this is important because we talk about production. And Marx look at the product. When you look at a society, when you study society, you ask the question, in whose interest? And when you study the society, you can study the production, how the society is arranged, how the society is arranged around its production. Who produces what and who is not producing what? Okay, what are the gains of the production? When you compare the global north and the global south or the Caribbean, as again, we talk about in the global south, in Jamaica, okay, in Jamaica or the global south, the Jamaica or the global south, the production, their specialization in the global north is more, but it's more around the raw material. Say, for example, let's look at bauxite. Okay, we are more we focus, the Caribbean, Jamaica, would focus on on extracting the bauxite. Okay, extracting the raw material, and then we send it to the global north for them to refine it and and for the finishing, and then they sell it back to us for how much money do we get from the raw material? First of all, we don't have the technology to turn the aluminium, the bauxite into aluminium and the minerals, the finish, one. Okay, and two, and we don't have the capital, and we were not developed, and we weren't developed in a way to develop our capacity to be able to do that. So now we still have to, although we have bauxite, in terms of the production process, our focus is more on the raw material. Talk about specialization and the raw material, the input as against output. What in the Caribbean, when you look at the Caribbean or compare society, that you look at the production process, okay, are we at the final stage of production or the early stage? No, majority of the Caribbean countries or the post-industrial countries, they are more on the first stages. And not only that, that was the idea in recreating the new world, in recreating the Caribbean after independence and so on, making in terms of globalization, the Caribbean and the black and brown countries were supposed to be the workers. When you look at the production cycle or the stage of production that the Caribbean should occupy is at the beginning, the first stage. Okay, the raw material, or extracting the bauxite, and then we send it to the mother country or to the global south to do the finish, because they have the know-how. We don't have the know-how. We don't have the intelligence. Okay, they have the intelligence. They have the capability. In terms of, you look at the production. So the production of ours, the fact that most of our economic arrangement borders or focuses on the raw material, the early stage, that also affects our gain and our wealth and our earnings. Those countries and peoples who are more focused on the last or the end or the output or the last stage of production, society determines that they get more money, they are paid more, okay, they benefit more than those who are at the first stage. Who are those at the first stage? The Caribbean or the black and brown nations. When you start to look at the production, how production happens in societies and where people are in terms of the stages, and it will give you an understanding of the gains that some people have and the gains that some people don't have. Okay, when you start to study society. Anyways, let's wrap up this real quickly, because I'm going to stop at 6:15 and then we'll pick up where we left off. Okay?
In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generals weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So, in other words, Marx believed that individuals tended to see the world according to their role within the means of production, as business owners, for example, or as wage earners. The interests of those often competing groups is what drives history, according to Marx. Antonio Gramsci extended Marx's theory to the discussion of culture, and in doing so laid the groundwork for subaltern history, or history from below. Put simply, Gramsci developed a theory of cultural hegemony, stating that the dominant social class, for example the bourgeoisie or the business owners, not only had a big influence over the economy, but they had a big influence over a society's culture as well. Gramsci believed that the creation of an alternative or proletarian culture, that is, a culture of the workers promoting revolutionary ideas, that these were necessary for the overthrow of capitalism and the rise of the communist state. So to some extent, this is also the goal of subaltern studies, of which the Black Jacobins plays a very early part. Subaltern studies represent the history of groups excluded from the dominant culture. While James was strongly influenced by a Marxist approach to history, the Black Jacobins is not rooted in any particular academic school or debate. Rather, it emerged from the tense political environment of the late 1930s. C.L.R. James was a keen observer of both political events and cultural developments, and there is some evidence that the author was inspired by his immediate surroundings in London while he was writing The Black Jacobins. In The Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James asks a central question. How did a group of uneducated slaves in what is today Haiti successfully overthrow their colonial masters and defeat the invasions that followed from France, from Britain, and from Spain? As the only successful slave revolt in history, the events in Saint-Domingue warrant attention. As an historian, James' aim is to describe the slave revolt from the point of view of the revolutionaries and their leader, Toussaint Louverture. Throughout James's historical investigations, he is asking another question as well. What is the nature of revolution? And what are the conditions in which the proletariat, or the workers, can overthrow those responsible for their oppression? Although James does not explicitly frame his discussion in these terms, his political viewpoint informs his discussion of history. James's Marxist beliefs also place the book squarely in the heart of the political conflicts of the late 1930s. As he writes, the violent conflicts of our age enable our practiced vision to see into the very bones of previous revolutions more easily than heretofore. He refers to the violent upheavals going on across Europe at the time, the eve of World War II. He notes the revolts held by the fascist leader in Spain when he writes of Franco's heavy artillery, and refers to the mass repression in the Soviet Union when he writes of the rattle of Stalin's firing squads. Such is our age, and this book is of it, with something of the fever and the fret. He writes in The Black Jacobins, the writer has sought not only to analyze, but to demonstrate in their movement the economic forces of the age, their molding of society and politics, of men in the mass and individual men, the powerful reaction of these on their environment at one of those rare moments when society is at boiling point and therefore fluid. As a work of history, The Black Jacobins builds upon previous works on the Revolution in Saint-Domingue and the conditions there more generally, much of it published in French. These works include scholarly histories, first-person accounts, official archives, and travel books. James provides an annotated bibliography of these works in the book, in which he writes, despite the importance and interest of the subject, it was for long difficult to find in English or French a comprehensive treatment of the Saint-Domingue Revolution. Both in insight and objectivity, the Haitian writers are easily the best. James draws on a long list of sources, notably Colonel Henri de Pouillon-Belize, and his history of 1899, Histoire militaire de la Révolution de Saint-Domingue, or a military history of the Revolution of San Domingo. James writes of this book, this is the official French account. Pouillon misunderstands the whole campaign, both the offensive plan of Leclerc and the defensive plan of Toussaint. There is no limit to the brazenness of these imperialist historians. Despite disagreeing with Pouillon's version of history, James finds the historian to be a careful scholarly writer, and is able to build on Pouillon's work. This is a theme in James's work. Though he frequently disagrees with the work of scholars who went before him, he finds that he can use their work in his own. In an important way, James's history of the Haitian Revolution builds on the work of the scholars of another revolt that started barely 2 years earlier, the French Revolution. As he notes in The Black Jacobins, it is impossible to understand the Saint-Domingue Revolution unless it is studied in close relationship with the Revolution in France. Fortunately, the French Historical School of the French Revolution is one of the greatest historical schools of Western civilization. James lists in the book several French historians who inspired his own study of the Haitian Revolution. They exposed the economic foundations of the French Revolution. They wrote about the personalities of the main actors and covered the politics of the period. James credits these influences in the book on the Haitian Revolution. I have sought all through to show the direct influence of the French Revolution on events and leading personalities in Saint-Domingue. It appears from James's biography that the awareness of and interest in this history was sparked when he moved to Europe in the 1930s. In that sense, the intellectual basis of the work is James's attempt to unify his understanding of West Indian culture, that is, the culture of the islands of the Caribbean Sea, and history with the debates over history and politics going on at the time in England and France. So, in other words, James was very much influenced by historians of the French Revolution when he wrote The Black Jacobins. This is D. Elizabeth Glasgow.
Caribbean history and DNA. Caribbean history and DNA. In 1492 CE, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic and landed in the Americas. He and his men were the first to wash up in the Bahamas, Hispaniola, Dominican Republic and Haiti, and eastern Cuba. From Europe. They weren't the first to do so, but they weren't the first to wash up there. Not the first. But however, on their return to Spain, he and his brother Bartholomew later returned to the Americas and identified Hispaniola's land and indigenous people as potentially profitable for the Spanish crown. Bartholomew estimated about 1.1 million people lived on Hispaniola, but modern scholars have generally used the range of 250,000 to 1 million people. However, the actual Caribbean Aboriginal population is now known based on a new Caribbean DNA study published in the journal Nature, which fuses decades of archaeological work with cutting-edge genetic technology. And this breakthrough study shows that the local population before the arrival of the Spanish was much lower and far less heterogeneous than thought. That is from critical thinking. Caribbean DNA study challenges Spanish assumptions. Professor David Reich of the Harvard Medical School led a team of researchers who analyzed the genomes of 263 individuals, representing the largest ever study of ancient human DNA in the Americas. The Caribbean DNA study concluded that the Caribbean had been settled by two major migratory waves of highly mobile people separated by thousands of years. However, according to an article by the Florida Museum of Natural History, on their way to this conclusion, the researchers developed a new genetic technique for estimating the island's past population size prior to the first Spanish landings. This is quite important. Now, when the first Europeans arrived, the number of people living in the Caribbean was far smaller than 1.1 million, reported by Columbus's brother Bartholomew. Professor of Archaeology William Keegan from the Florida's Museum of Natural History was co-senior author of the new study, and he told the New York Times that this study of ancient DNA moves the academic understanding of the Caribbean's history forward dramatically. In one fell swoop, two ancient waves of Caribbean DNA. The new genetic evidence offers insights into the early people of the Caribbean and suggests that the island's first inhabitants were a group of stone tool users who had boated to Cuba about 6,000 years ago. Now, these first inhabitants expanded eastward and populated other smaller islands during the region's Archaic Age. The study determined that they had closer genetic links with people from Central and South America compared to the ancient DNA from North American Indian cultures, and further cementing this origins story. Now, artifacts found in Belize and Cuba also suggest they had a Central American origin. The second ancient pathway into the Caribbean was forged 2,500 to 3,000 years ago by groups of migrating farmers. The paper says these people were related to the Arawak speakers of Northeast or South America, who had paddled the fingers of South America's Orinoco River basin from the interior to coastal Venezuela, then northwards into the Caribbean Sea. After settling on Puerto Rico, these explorers traveled westward, beginning the region's ceramic age, which is defined by these farmers' agricultural methods and style of pottery. Now, the New Caribbean DNA study also relied on ceramic evidence. Before this new study was published, there had always been unclarity regarding the various styles of pottery discovered in the Caribbean, each of which was associated with later migration waves. However, the newly gained genetic information finally determines that all the fragments of ancient pottery found in the region were created by one group of people over time. Another aspect of the study analyzed the X chromosomes from 19 pairs of genetic cousins who had all lived on different islands but were separated by several generations. For example, the DNA from a man buried in the Bahamas was matched with another man discovered 600 miles away in the Dominican Republic, according to the paper. Dr. Reich wrote that there's such a finding. By the way, I'm gonna pause right there to suggest this. It is not difficult. They didn't have the ease of mobility. They never had the ease of mobility. The people in the islands at the time, these people, they never had the ease of mobility. So yes, you can find that one man was related to another person 600 years, but it shows how the travel was active. And I said that in the last class. The people of the Caribbean, they were actively traveling. And many of these, and they washed up on the islands. And by the way, the narrative begins by saying that Christopher Columbus were the first people to have washed up on the islands. But then later on talk about other people mobile people who were washed up on the island, mobile farmers who came and traveled all along the island. So that's a contradiction right there, okay? But it is quite interesting as we talk about the importance of rethinking our heritage and studying our heritage and our roots and questioning whether or not we have misunderstood our heritage. And now we're hearing that what we thought about the Spanish DNA is completely different. Now new studies researchers are finding some different evidence that's suggesting something different and something new as it relates to how the people of the Caribbean were closely connected, although they were separate. But they were very diverse and mixed, and there was lots of intermingling that has always defined the Americas. By the way, you can watch this video. Is available. It's called Caribbean Origins, History, Migrations, and DNA. I won't read any more of this, but it is available on YouTube, and you notice these people's help. So you guys can watch that. I'll stop right here.